Hi, this is Mark McFall, Pioneer Sales Rep from Prince Edward County, Ontario. You're listening to the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for joining the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast. I'm Andrew Campbell, and we're really excited about what is our final episode of the fourth season of the podcast, because we're doing something that turned out really well last year, and that was looking back over the past year, maybe taking a few lessons from it, so that we can do even better in 2023. For that, we had Paul Hermans last year, and because it was so well received, we thought we better get you back, Paul. Thanks for joining.
Great to be here, Andrew. Live in person,
Which is very exciting. You crossed the province for us. You are the area agronomist covering Eastern Ontario. We've also got Greg Stopps. Greg is also an area agronomist covering what I call kind of Midwestern Ontario. Greg, you also graciously say yes anytime we ask you to be on the podcast. Thanks for doing this.
It is an absolute pleasure to be back, Andrew. So, and again on video and in person, I'm excited.
This is high class here. So now, one of the things, I think the easiest question to start with is just like how things went in your areas. And I know, we did discuss this a little bit ahead of time, and it really is kind of a tale of almost two different stories when we look at one side of the province to the other. Paul, let's start on your end of the province. Like, how'd things turn out in 2022 in Eastern Ontario?
So overall, Andrew, I think it was a phenomenal year when I look at all the crops. From a corn standpoint, we're as good or not better than 2021. Winter wheat was amazing. Some guys, the highest yields ever. And then soybeans was kind of like hit and miss depending on where we got the rain. So overall, thumbs up.
Thumbs up. Greg, overall thumbs up for you, or maybe not quite?
I think the end result was overall thumbs up for a lot of people. And it was pretty surprising here in southwestern Ontario. But there were its challenges. We had some significant drought pressure through the season, which threw a wrench in things for beans and corn especially, not so much wheat, ironically, but for beans and corn, and presented some unique stressors that did come out throughout the season. And that challenged folks in certain parts of southwestern Ontario. Some parts more than others, but we saw that variability develop. So it's not a straightforward thumbs up for everyone in southwestern Ontario.
Yeah. Well, and it does create challenges for as we go through this conversation, because part of that is, well, if you get the rain, then obviously it can turn out. But I still think we can pull out some lessons from 2022. Paul, you mentioned like what a fantastic year it was for corn. Let's start there. What made it so fantastic? Like, what can a grower learn from this year that worked so well that maybe they can do again for 2023?
I think one of the biggest things, Andrew, is guys were patient. They didn't rush the planting. They waited for the right conditions and planted in good conditions. We got a nice uniform stand at the end of the day. If I look at 2021, some of the guys, they rushed it. We got 3,000 to 4,000 less plants. This year, we're maybe 500, but more of a uniform tabletop. And that, added more yield at the end of the day, at the end of the season. So that was probably the key thing that I would say overall.
Mm-hmm. Well, because if you talk about like 3,000 or 4,000 less plants, like that's a big knock on the percentage of just what the potential is on that.
Exactly. And I always talk about, 1,000 plants, cobs. Let's talk similar years per acre, 7 to 10 bushels.
So is that what about that 1,000 is?
Exactly. So it kind of gives you a ballpark idea, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So then, Greg, now let's pull out the rain factor a little bit. Like, I would say certainly being in that Western Ontario, we had a good start. Things went in quite well. A lesson kind of from the East too, in that, we start off, at least we had the chance.
Yeah, and I think for the most part, southwestern Ontario started off really, really well. There were a few areas as you got into some of the heavy clays that did get some heavy rains early in May that took a while to dry out, and they were off to a slower start. But a lot of folks did get their planting done really well into great conditions, right? And that set us up well with good early stands, right? But then the drought started to slip in, right? And it's then where we started to see some of the variability. So a big learning for us really isn't so much tied to the planting conditions of 2022, but some of the harvest conditions of 2021. And if you think back to 2021, we had a pile of moisture through the fall. We mudded out a lot of crop, whether it was soybeans or corn. And as we went back into rotation this year, we have been stuck dealing with issues of compaction. And those compacted parts of the field led to a pile of variability that we saw as soon as the tap went dry on us, right? So that's a big learning piece, is how we treat that crop in the previous fall is really, really important for our overall success. No matter how good the planting conditions are initially, once those roots get going, it's really important for us to make sure that it's not compacted underneath that. So every plant can retain its uniformity and then retain its yield potential.
So like guys, in that case, because in a year like 2021 where you kind of had to get in to get it, and you did leave some problems, what do you do about that? How could we have solved that maybe before we went in, or is it just something you have to deal with for a couple of years while that compaction comes out?
It's tough because I think you got to get that crop off, right? And you're kind of going against Mother Nature and what, as Greg said, came forward to us in 2021. You can't quite just hit the switch and take care of that right away. So it's kind of a long-term thing. I'm thinking about tillage, crop rotation, other benefits that you can bring into your farm operation to kind of help take care of that compaction issue.
Yeah, and that's there's Paul's right on. It's hard to deal with that, right? You take what the weather gives you. I think there are long-term strategies that help us deal with those things too, right? And what we've seen in southwestern Ontario, or at least what I've seen, is we are really pushing our relative maturities, and we're getting the heat that has supported that over the last few years. But fall conditions don't always support us pushing those relative maturities in corn, right? And we're getting to that point where in 2021, there was some corn that was wet, it was waiting to dry down, it was fuller season, right? Arguably, we may have been able to get at it a little bit earlier, right, into slightly better conditions. Maybe not, given the times of the rain. It doesn't always work out that way. But if long-term we're planting the correct relative maturities, we are setting ourselves up for better success at getting that crop out of the field and not letting stuff slip into the November or the December time frame where we're harvesting and stuff that's not frozen, that's muddy, and that doesn't leave us any time for that tillage piece, right? That's important for remediating any compaction that's done.
Well, and I would think like 2022 to me, like, is that year where we seem to get that time. Like the crop did come off. It came off in good condition. Yep. People had time for manure and tillage and stuff that they haven't. Like, is that setting us up already for a good 2023?
And I would definitely agree with that. I mean, we didn't have the compaction. I never had mud on my boots, mud on the roads from, combines going up and down. And it was just phenomenal. So that's going to be that much better for the 2023 growing season going forward. We had lots of people do, tillage, put in tile drains, get the fertility on. So setting ourselves up for a really good 2023 season.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, the other thing, just kind of through the in-season of corn, and this goes back to, having these conversations over the last couple of years. Like you talk about the wet years where like fungicide was like the big thing. Like we got to get that on in corn. Whereas this year, maybe it wasn't as prevalent. I'd be kind of interested to see what you guys think. Like, is it a case of we found even in a dry year, it's worth putting on?
I remember 12 months ago, tar spot was the big thing that we talked about, right? We didn't see tar spot, east of Toronto, so we were lucky. Disease-wise, very limited pressure our way, kind of running through the numbers, 4 to 6 bushels, what we saw from a corn response. So not as high as what we maybe see in Southern Ontario through the Midwest, but again, less disease pressure. And that's the key thing I think we've got to look at, scout, and figure out what's out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Greg, because I'm curious, on ours, on the one that we did put fungicide on this year was actually that 75Q. Mm-hmm. And like the stalk was greener, even though the corn was drier. Like it was an interesting thing. Like is that good long term for what was our yield at the end of the year?
Yeah, so I think it kind of depends, right? And sometimes that picture in corn is a little unclear, right, when we apply fungicides. I think we target fungicides hugely for disease management. Like Paul mentioned, we talked a lot about tar spot. And then with the drought that we had this year in southwestern Ontario, we didn't see that tar spot pressure develop, right? I mean, ultimately, it was so dry that it didn't really take hold until near the end of harvest season for us. So that need to spray specifically for that disease didn't really arise, right? Now, there are people who still spray, and for yourself in a silage sort of scenario, there are a lot who spray for plant health, which comes with huge benefits. And what we saw this year was that we saw healthier silage. Oftentimes, if you weren't in a real dry zone, that equated to a little bit better yields because you release some of that stress that those plants might have been under by just making them that much healthier, allowing them to set that much more starch before they were harvested as silage or even as grain, right? And that materializes itself as test weight or kernel weight, whatever you want to look at that as. And I think that does set yourself up for a better crop when you have it healthier. You also potentially help the plant too, right? So one of the results of real drought stress and prolonged drought stress that we can see sometimes isn't yield loss, but it's actually effects on the overall agronomics of the plant, right? So when you have a plant that pollinates fully and sets that potential for each and every kernel, but then it's been dry throughout that whole season, the one thing it wants to do to respond is just to finish every one of those kernels. And it does so by really drawing from all of its plant reserves, right? So when you apply a fungicide and you make that plant healthier, it draws from those plant reserves that are a little bit healthier, right? And you don't see the same degree of cannibalization of the stalks and all of those things, right? Versus unsprayed, we saw a lot of stalks that started to break down. And I mean, we were very lucky. The grain dried down really appropriately and helped us. We got it out of the field in good time. I would be far more nervous if we had a backwards fall and things were wet into November because the stalks weren't ready to take it this year. They lost so much finishing the grain because of the drought stress conditions throughout the province and because of the duration of those drought stress conditions kind of through June, July, up into mid-August, and then even into September in some areas, right?
Mm-hmm.
So.
Mm-hmm. Then just last on corn, the one question, especially going into 2023, it's not like fertilizer is going to get cheaper, by the looks of things. And we had these questions, over many episodes about what do we do on the fertility side. For those that, maybe did skimp a little bit, I'm not sure you can do that another year again. Like, what's kind of the answer to fertility that you guys see for next year?
So our way, especially, we've gone through 2 years now of high yields. We're taking a lot of nutrients off with that yield. You got to definitely look at soil fertility. If you haven't done that 1 in 3 year sampling, do that. I'm really more a proponent of doing zone sampling, high-low areas, figure that out and kind of go from there. Because we're going to pay the piper sooner or later. So you might as well pay now and get the fertility down and think long term.
Yeah, absolutely, right? And I mean, thinking about that fertility, I am not a proponent of ever shorting the crop, right? I mean, we are taking higher and higher yields all the time. And yeah, we didn't achieve necessarily the yields we wanted to across all of southwestern Ontario this year, but they were surprisingly high for as dry a year as it was, right? Which means we have taken a lot out of that soil. And we've got to replace it, right? And we got to focus on the big ones. We got to focus on the P and the K, right? The nitrogen, it kind of always will be there, and we have to consider that. There's not a whole lot of corners we can cut on it, especially if we want that 200 bushel, 220 bushel crop that everyone seems to be shooting for now, right? I mean, we've really got to pay attention to that. Now, I think there's maybe some interesting question of other things we can do to help with that, with biologicals and things. But where we're at today, I don't think we're at a point where we're going to straight replace those nitrogen programs. And then for those of us, and you have a lot of livestock your way, Paul, and we have a lot of livestock in the area I cover, a little less in the south, but I mean, manure is a hugely valuable resource too that we also have to think through. And my encouragement for folks is, as you're looking at your fertility plans, there was a lot of manure that went out this year, which is great. Make sure you're, know what was in that manure, and any of the N that was potentially in it that you're putting on this fall, don't necessarily count that towards that crop next year, right? Because N is that one that will slip away pretty quickly. That organic matter is awesome that's going on in the field. The P and the K that might be in that manure, awesome. But you got to know what level you're at so that you can kind of balance that back with either a sustain or a build approach in your field.
Crop rotation too came up a lot with customers this fall, just corn on corn, not as happy with yields, the stands, that kind of stuff. So I think we got to definitely look at crop rotation where we can and get away from the corn on corn. And then, if we're doing that, some guys have to do corn on corn. What can we do from an equipment standpoint, manage that residue, get better plant stands going forward. So some of the tips that I kind of picked up this year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, then on the rotation, for those that don't have to do it, I mean, soybeans, price of beans is still, means a pretty profitable crop is there. Certainly, you both are talking kind of, surprising yields in terms of maybe not record for you, Paul, but still like good yields. What did we do right that made that, and can we repeat it again next year?
I think a lot of it, I mean, it comes down to, I hate to say it, but Mother Nature. But you got to have the basis, the foundation set right. And the one thing I learned this year, or kind of stuck with me, is manage. Don't give up on your crop, especially in soybeans. I mean, we had soybean aphids this year, and a lot of guys got tired of having to drive the sprayer and walk fields and everything else. But for the guys that did that, they were up a good 5 to 10 bushels at the end, and that really economically pays.
Big.
Oh, huge.
So,
yeah.
Then, kind of in Western Ontario, aphids, that I never heard they were an issue. What were, some of the things that
I'd say we haven't had huge problems. There have been pockets here and there, right, with some. Little different year for us again, right? And we achieved pretty good yields in most places. There were some with beans that I guess weren't that high, right? And I mean, again, a huge part of those bean yields is linked to Mother Nature and timely rains in August, right? I think maybe why we were surprised on some of the yields is in part due to the drought stress that we had here, right? That early dry conditions in June and July really caused the soybean to try to drive its roots a little bit deeper. And soybeans are pretty pitiful when it comes to rooting structure, let's be honest, right? They're not a great crop at root development, right? But the bigger their roots get under some stress conditions, right, the more opportunity they have to gather up all the nutrients they need to set those beans when they get rains timely in August, right? And so the areas that got those timely rains and a little bit of that drought relief really did pull through, right? I think some of the variability we see in beans this year, what we learned was, maturity really matters too, right? If you're those who are planting ultra early beans, I think paid the price a little bit if those beans weren't still flowering by the time we got those rains, right? Those who were a little longer seemed to pick that up, but that's not clear cut everywhere. But it certainly sort of showed itself this year, right? And we had very little disease pressure. Yeah. Dry conditions led to very little disease pressure for us. The one big issue in southwestern Ontario that I think we can learn about as we go forward is cyst pressure really showed its ugly head, right? And it has become more and more of an insidious problem for us in southwestern Ontario, especially in the earlier groups where we haven't always faced those challenges in the past. That's now creeping in, right? And in a dry year, we see the impacts of cyst that much greater that if you weren't taking notice of those things in your field this year, you might be surprised with the pressure and the amount of pressure that's there in future years. So hopefully folks took note of where those pockets were in field so that we can switch to different varieties with cyst tolerance in the future and make sure we're selecting the right variety to go back on those fields with in a few years.
Well, and that was my question, is like the variety selection is the big one. Like crop rotation, does that solve that too? Like what are some of those cyst
helps it?
strategies?
I know like for Eastern Ontario, we're not quite as bad as Southern Ontario yet for soybean cyst. Yeah. Starting to see it come into play there. Mm-hmm. Disease-wise, like white mold for us is a big one. July, we were, lawns were still green, cutting lawn every week, but luckily we didn't get mold. It's just a timing thing. We were lucky that way, but definitely in the cyst with varieties, rotation, soil sampling, keep ahead of what's out there, knowing your fields, and just trying to manage it going forward.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Then the last one just on soybeans is kind of weed pressure. I think is that one that, continuously creeps in, whether it's, horsetail for you, whether it's, the list keeps growing, in terms of what it is, in the south. Like, what's that kind of weed strategy that maybe we can learn from, for next year?
Well, I think a big part of it is, again, variety selection, but technology in those varieties, right? So it's no secret where we're going, right? We're going to enlist soybeans, and we love that chemical program because it's providing us a chance to put multiple modes of action on our soybeans in crop. Right, with the opportunity to put Enlist or Liberty or Roundup, right? That gives us 3 great modes of action in crop on top of all the other soybean chemistries that we're used to using, right? And in southwestern Ontario, at least the area I cover, we are very lucky in that we've had a huge amount of edible beans and IP beans for a number of years, and growers have had to use sort of traditional chemistries in those beans to keep them clean. I think going forward, we've got to make sure we're using those chemistries, those multiple modes of actions, whether it's in the setup, giving yourself a residual, and then coming back in with the technologies that are at our fingertips that allow to apply herbicides in an appropriate manner at the appropriate time for that weed spectrum in your field.
I'd echo that like the enlist for Eastern Ontario, a lot of people are interested, especially if, like, talked about horsetail. But flea bane's coming, water hemp we're starting to see our way as well.
Too.
Yeah.
So it's just, we're setting ourselves up and want to make sure that we do a good herbicide program going down the road. It's that multiple mode of actions that's really going to help us out.
Yeah, is the big one. Then lastly, let's talk about wheat, because I think, I see an interesting wheat. Obviously, the crop's in, right now, but I see a pretty interesting picture in that, you've come out of a record yield year, as you said. We in this part of the country have more wheat acres than I certainly have seen for a very long time. Anything we can do to kind of help it along, once we get to spring at least?
That's the big thing. Let's wait till spring. A lot of guys worry right now about, do I have snow on top?
Of course I gotta worry about it. I'm looking for a record,
Paul. There's not a whole lot we can do about it, Andrew, until really, the end of April, May in Eastern Ontario. Do the stand counts, look at your fertility program, weed control, the general concepts that we always talk about. And just, I'd say, let's wait till May, see what happens, and kind of go from there. But overall, in Eastern Ontario, we're up on acres. And it's a lot of benefit for rotation, for what it does for corn, beans, spreads out that workload and everything else. So we're happy where we are with our wheat in Eastern Ontario.
Yeah, and it went in at a great time this year. We're up in acres in the area that I cover as well. Our area, it seems to be fairly stable as well because of the livestock production. So we had a lot of acres in last year and a considerable amount of the province's total acres last year. But even then, we're seeing those acres tick up, right? And we got them in a great time. The crop, for the most part, looks to be in great shape going into winter. Now it's the sit and wait period, right? And it's I start looking at wheat, when that snow starts coming off the field in March, right? And I'm looking for those stand establishment pieces. I'm looking for number of tillers, and that drives my decisions from then on, right? In terms of how early I should be getting on with my nitrogen application, whether it should be one shot, whether it should be two, right? Looking at all of those things really comes down to the spring. And we always kind of joke that we got to write the crop off 3 or 4, maybe even 5 times, right? And then we run out of time to tear it up, and and then we end up keeping it, and it ends up being bin busting yields off of a crop that we wrote off, right? But wheat is one of those things where we really just have to sit and wait at this point in time. But I have big expectations for it next year. We're getting really good at managing our wheat crop, whether that's with herbicide applications, fungicide. More guys have clued into the amount of sulfur and nitrogen they really have to put on a crop to chase those high yields, how to manage some of those standability issues in high nitrogen management sort of situations too. And that's awesome, right? Because we are starting to see yields in that higher kind of range of 110, 120, even 130 plus, right? Yields more consistently because of our management strategies down here. So,
and it's not just a case of, wheat prices are up obviously too. So growers feel they can invest more. Like what is helping drive a lot of that management decisions between, whether it is the herbicide, whether it's a fungicide, whether it's the fertility, all of those aspects.
If I look at our varieties, at least for Eastern Ontario, we've come a long way, especially with winter hardiness and fusarium resistance too, right? So that's definitely helped out. And then I think guys have done a good job in the other management, getting pH, drainage in line. Like drainage for us is key. Yeah. Greg talked about, March time. That's when we can lose a lot of our wheat. We get a big rainfall and then all of a sudden -10. Well, if I get that water away easy enough, that definitely helps out. So just different things like that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons wheat's attractive, right? I mean, it's the price is right now, and certainly those who are forward booking stuff this fall, right, have achieved a price they probably never imagined, right? Which is awesome, right? And I think that's a big driver of it. But I also look at the other costs. It's relatively cheap to manage wheat. Some of the herbicide programs are a little cheaper. It doesn't take as much of the fertility as some of the other crops do, right? And certainly as much as corn. And so it looks like wheat has kind of flipped, and for the time being, it's no longer poverty grass. It's prosperity grass here in southwestern Ontario. So I think it's an exciting time to be growing wheat. And let's not forget, we often put dollars and cents to some of these things, but the value of wheat in rotation is huge, right? It's really important to not be stuck into these, 2 crop rotations, right? And if you can, get into a 3rd crop, get into a 4th crop if you can, right? But I mean, having wheat in rotation as a 3 crop rotation with corn and beans is so valuable to the soil structure and the overall health of these farms in southwestern Ontario and in eastern Ontario.
Exactly. We got a lot of guys are doing cover crops after wheat. harvest, right? So it just gives us an extra month, 6 weeks of window to grow that cover crop. So doing a lot of soil health benefits like you talked about, Greg.
Yeah, huge.
Sounds great. Well, I think that's a great wrap and certainly looking forward to 2023. So Greg, Paul, thanks for joining
Great.
the podcast.
Thanks.
Thank
Great
you
to
so
be here.
much, Andrew.
Yep.
And thank you for joining our last episode of our 4th season of the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast. Certainly, on behalf of everybody who works hard to put this together, we appreciate your support throughout the season. If you haven't had a chance to listen to all of the episodes, you can find them on popular podcast apps like Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you happen to download your podcasts. And don't forget, if you ever need more information or advice, you can always ask your local Pioneer rep or visit pioneer.com/Canada.